He went only as far as the king's gate because it was against the law for anyone to pass through it wearing mourning clothes. At the same time, in every province and place where the king's order and his new law arrived, a very great sadness came over the Jews. They gave up eating and spent whole days weeping and crying out loud in pain. Many Jews lay on the ground in mourning clothes and ashes. When Esther's female servants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai, the queen's whole body showed how upset she was. She sent everyday clothes for Mordecai to wear instead of mourning clothes, but he rejected them. Then Esther sent for Hathach, one of the royal eunuchs, whose job it was to wait on her. She ordered him to go to Mordecai and find out what was going on, why he was acting this way. Hathach went out to Mordecai, to the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him. He spelled out the exact amount of silver that Haman promised to pay into the royal treasury. It was in exchange for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave Hathach a copy of the law made public in Susa concerning the Jews' destruction, so that Hathach could show it to Esther and report it to her. Through him, Mordecai ordered her to go to the king to seek his kindness and to help her people. Hathach came back and told Esther what Mordecai had said. In reply, Esther ordered Hathach to tell Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people in his province know that there's a single law in a case like this. Any man or woman who comes to the king in the inner courtyard excuse me, without being called is put to death. Only the person to whom the king holds out the golden scepter may live. In my case, I haven't been called to come to the king for the past 30 days. When they told Mordecai Esther's words, he had them respond to Esther, "Don't think for 1 minute that unlike all the other Jews, you'll come out of this alive, simply because you are in the palace. In fact, if you don't speak up at this very time, relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. But who knows, maybe it was for a time like this that you came to be a part of the royal family." Esther sent back word to Mordecai, "Go, gather all of the Jews who are in Susa and tell them to give up eating to help me be brave. They aren't to eat or drink anything for 3 whole days, and I myself will do the same, along with my female servants. Then, even though it's against the law, I will go to the king, and I will die. If I am to die, then die. I will." Mordecai left where he was and did exactly what Esther ordered him to do. This is the word of the Lord. For our slide today, we have a beautiful photo from the artist James Lewis. And he has done this project of creating African American images of Bible characters. You can go online, I have a link, and look at the rest of his work. They are stunning. There's a visual image of characters. So I stood there, staring at my car, willing the door to open, wishing that that car key were in my hand. It started to snow and the temperatures were dropping, the sun was setting behind the mountains, and I was stuck there. Other skiers and snowboarders were walking on by, making their way home, and I was scrambling, trying to find my car key. I searched all of my pockets of my coat. Now, the ski coat that I normally wore, I put it in the exact same place every time I went skiing. I would zip it shut and make sure it was there. But this season, I was a ski instructor, and they gave us official coats to wear. And I kid you not, these coats had like 30 pockets in them. And so who knows which pocket I wound up putting it in that morning. Well, I searched and I searched. I even had the ski school director, search my coat as well. I was starting to shiver, the wind was picking up, I was getting frustrated, and this key was nowhere to be found. I thought maybe I left it in the locker room, it wasn't there. Checked, lost, and found, it wasn't there either. I was starting to lose hope. I was 2 hours from home, up in the mountains. I couldn't just run home and get my spare key and get on my way. So I called a local locksmith. And it just so happens that the only locksmith in Winter Park, Colorado, had eye surgery that day and couldn't leave the house. So he suggested that I call someone from Denver, about an hour down the road. He said it would cost a pretty penny, but hopefully be less than a night in the ski lodge. Well, I did what any self-respecting adult would do. I called my dad. I needed somebody else to kind of sort through these options, help me decide, would it be better to wait to see if I could find that key, stay up there in the mountains, or should I call that expensive Denver locksmith? My dad, of course, offered a third option, one that I had not considered and did not even want, which was he would drive up there with the spare key that they had. Well, I knew this would be an inconvenience for him. It was a weeknight. It was already 7 o'clock. It would take him 2 hours to get up there, 2 hours to get back home. He had to work the next day. I didn't want to inconvenience him. But of course, he refused to listen to my protest, and in an act of love, he headed my way. I greeted him with this huge hug, but we got in the car quickly because I didn't want to delay the trip home any further. And when we got about 50 feet out of the parking lot, he called me on the cell phone. He was driving behind me. He said, "You have no rear lights. Pull over, we need to check your car." And it turns out there was a fuse out, so the lights in back weren't working at all. Thankfully, he knew exactly what to do. I would have had no clue, but he quickly changed the fuse and we were on our way. As I focused on keeping my car on the road, on those icy roads, my mind began to race about what could have happened. What if I had driven home with no rear lights? No tail lights to indicate to the person behind me that I was there. No brake lights to let them know when I was slowing down or stopping. The road I had to travel on was Berthoud Pass, which is treacherous on a clear, sunny day. But it's even worse on a snowy night. With ice building on the lanes, I made my way down the mountain with my mind racing. To make that drive without rear lights could have been fatal. And to this day, I still have questions about that night. What if my dad had driven in front of me instead of behind and not noticed the lights were out? What if I had gotten the local locksmith to come make a key and I'd driven off unaware that those lights were out? What if I hadn't lost the key in the first place and driven on? I have no doubt that God was with me that night. That God put this series of events into place, making it happen as it did, opening my eyes to the preciousness of life, to God's love, to the protection of God. Now, during this time in my life, I was in a season where I was sort of taking a break from church and from faith. I had just graduated, I was back living at home, I was in a rough spot, and let's just say I wasn't really on good terms with God and the church and all of that. I do remember saying a prayer as I was searching for my key, but It wasn't anything specific like, show me where the key is. It was more of, please help. Well, God responded. Not quite in an obvious way. I'm sure naysayers would say, well, why wouldn't God just fix the fuse in the first place? Or why wouldn't God just not make your lights go out in the first place? I don't know for sure, but I think the answer is that I had to experience God's movement through alternate means, not a direct response. I had to experience God's faithfulness and love through that sacrificial act of my dad. I saw that love in him driving up those mountains when I'm sure he would have rather gone to bed. I saw God act and move through this compassionate gesture. And it was a time in my life where I needed that desperately, to get back on that road of faith. God has this way of working through other people, putting us in just the right place at just the right time, like when my dad rescued me that night. For the Jewish people living in Susa, it was Esther who was there at the right place at the right time. Who would have guessed that an orphan, a poor woman with no power, would be the one to save her people? She's the epitome of an unlikely heroine. She's a woman. At the time, she had no authority. She's basically just a trophy wife to boost the king's ego. So when she won that beauty pageant, became queen of Persia, no one would have guessed that she would be the one to save her people. But somebody had to do it. In the book of Esther, God appears silent. Never once is the name of the Lord even mentioned. It's kind of a strange book to be in the Bible. There's no indication that the people in exile were close to God or that they felt God's presence, even when they were facing genocide. God seems to have moved these people to the back burner and forgotten about them. Then Esther is called out to act on behalf of her people. And in that movement, we see God at work. Not in obvious ways, not in a direct response, but working through her to deliver the people. For a time such as this, God uses Esther, an unlikely heroine. God places a concern for her people on her heart, and she realizes she must act. She declares that she would approach her husband, the king, in his inner court, an act that would be punishable by immediate death. No one was allowed to enter the court unless they were summoned, not even the queen. But Esther is willing to perish if it means acting on behalf of God to save her people. She acts out of this sacrificial love, recognizing that God has placed this call upon her life. So she calls on Mordecai and all of the Jewish people in Susa to fast and to pray on her behalf, inviting God's presence to give her courage and strength. God keeps Esther safe even though she faced that certain death. God uses Esther to act, and she has courage. She saves the Jewish people. They turn out okay in this scenario. God works through Esther for a time such as this to make a miracle happen. God has this habit of working through those who are willing to sacrifice for others. We see this in Esther as she sacrifices herself to save the people. We see this in Christ on the cross, the ultimate example. A servant willing to perish so that others might live. What can we, the church, learn from these examples set by Esther and by Jesus? How can we embody that sacrificial love, that willingness to go and move for God, perishing if necessary? The truth is, there are larger churches out there, larger than ours, who are talking about closing their doors. They're struggling to make the budget work, to keep their ministry going. It used to be that people just showed up to church. That doesn't happen these days. It's a different time, and people aren't just showing up like they used to. And then they have this problem of these large facilities that used to be bustling with activity and now lay vacant during the week. I can't tell you how many pastors I've talked to who lament the rising repair costs, keeping up these facilities, having to make decisions to rent out the space, figuring out how to make it work, wishing they could use that money for ministry, for outreach. Many churches are anxious these days. It seems like the church is facing the threat of extinction. This is felt by congregations all over the U.S. and in some parts of the world. When I stepped into the role of session moderator around this time last year, what I heard was hope. I heard people express this desire to keep this church going. Despite the hardships and the grief and the challenges, what I heard was a deep love for this community of faith. And I got the sense that you all would rather close this church while putting up a fight than to walk away in defeat. I wonder, does this still hold true? Is this church still willing to put up that fight to be New Covenant? To continue to minister to the community of Austin and beyond, to be this beautifully, racially diverse church. As we discern God's plan for this congregation, what would it look like to take on that character of Esther? To take risks, to face the unknown, to be willing to perish if it means moving for God in big ways. Well, as we see in her story, the first step is prayer. She calls on all of the Jewish people to join her in prayer and fasting, to spend that time inviting God to be there with them. I encourage each one of us this Advent season to be in prayer, to ask how God is moving this church. Now, this doesn't mean praying for God to just miraculously bring more people into the church. That's not really how it works. That prayer would be futile. It'd be a lot like me praying for God to just make that key appear in my hand, right? Now, the funny thing is, I found the key in my jacket a couple days later. It was in one of the pockets. And I'm still, to this day, certain that I searched that pocket, and so did the ski school director. But we didn't find it. Asking for prayers like that to just make things show up is not how it works. Instead, we need to pray that God will show us how we can show up, how we can be a presence here in Austin. What is it that we are needed for a time such as this? How can we embody that sacrificial love just like Esther? The leaders of this church have been in a season of discernment, seeking out how the Spirit is moving in this congregation, looking at ways that we can move forward. Moving our church office to Parsons House. That's one of those things that we've discerned. It's a bold move. You'll hear about that in a little bit during our congregational meeting. And in the coming months, Session is going to be working through our mission statement, going line by line to discern if that really is the vision of this church. Are we still living into that call God has placed on us? We're going to explore ways that we might be called to something new and bold in this coming year. It's unclear what that conversation is going to look like, but I'm willing to bet the Spirit will show up in mighty ways, calling us to take big risks, doing things that we think might close the church, but that God will use us God will use our courage and tenacity to make beautiful things happen. Trusting that God will keep this church going and use this congregation for the work of the gospel. Remembering that God uses particular people for particular reasons, just like Esther. God tends to move in these big ways when we are willing to take big risks, calling us to show that sacrificial love for a time such as this.